whove gotten their bosses fired how? Story 1. The CEO publicly praised me for completing a task that my boss had struggled with. So my boss retaliated by forwarding all of his tasks to me in an effort to overwhelm me with work. I actually found his job pretty manageable, which the CEO also noticed and fired him, giving me his job in office. Story 2. He grabbed the back of my neck and said, "If you ever say I'm wrong in front of customer again, I will beat you." I went to the GM and told him, and my supervisor was relieved of his duties about 5 minutes later. Story 3. It was my supervisor. It got to the point that I had decided to quit. I had my resignation letter in my purse, but decided to let his boss know why I was quitting. Supervisor would talk about all the people on our team constantly, but only behind their backs. I got so sick of telling him to cut it out. My husband and I happened to work at the same place, different departments, and my supervisor would make comments about threesomes with him. What hotel we picked for our afternoon delight like that, it was so uncomfortable. Apart from this, he spent most of his supervising time outside smoking. Problem was, supervisor was one of the guys, and I was the only girl. Turns out his boss was disgusted. Told his boss, who lost his mind. They started an investigation which took 3 days. They interviewed staff. They corroborated what I said. They checked the security cameras, saw he was spending most of his workday outside smoking, and was fired. When he was told, he guessed wasn't hard, that I was the person who complained and tried to get to me to apologize that I took it the wrong way. The best feeling was my co-workers surrounding me as he was wailed out. That was a lovely ending to it all. Story 4. My boss hired me at a surprisingly good salary and got me 2 raises in the first 5 years. When the work slowed down to our department, he defended all his employees to management. They fired him the same day they fired me. Story 5 was working maintenance at an ice rink. The rule for anyone who knows how an ice rink works is if the Zamboni doors open, you get off the ice. Some head decided to ignore the fact that they were open and that I was standing in the doorway, and decided to rip off one last slap shot. The puck bounced off the glass and hit me in the head. I was okay, but reported it to my boss because we have to fill out an incident report for things like that. The boss asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I feel okay." Then he responded with, "Well, we don't really have to report it. Then do we?" I reminded him of the protocol, but it was clear he didn't want to do it. Since he wouldn't do it, I sent a descriptive email of the incident up to the administration because I felt there should be some sort of documentation paper trail in case, God forbid, I ended up having a brain hemorrhage or something a few days later. The boss was fired by my next shift. Story 6. I was fired because I abandoned my job while on short-term disability. Because while on approved leave, they are a date for me to return, never informed me by their own admission. And when I obviously didn't return to work, I was fired. The locker I had at work had my work boots in it that the company pays $90 a year towards. However, there isn't a payer under 100 available, so you always end up having some come out of your paycheck. At that point, they are yours regardless of the company line. They disagreed and said they were thrown out. I reported them stolen, and the HR director responsible for getting me fired was fired. Story 7. I took a cell phone video of her taking money from the safe and putting it in her wallet. I knew she was doing it, and I also knew that the moment it came out that money was missing, she'd blame it on me. She was so stupid that she didn't realize she should stop doing that while I was standing 10 feet away with my phone out and facing her. Story 8. Phoned him to tell him I won't be at work for the rest of the week as my mom is terminally ill in hospital. The next day, about an hour after she passed away, he phoned and asked why I wasn't at work. I just hung up on him so I wouldn't say anything that would get me in trouble. The next day, I sent the area manager a WhatsApp message explaining what had been done and attached a video of him breaking the freezer door while having a tantrum, which cost the store nearly $5,000 in lost stock and the repair costs, which had told the AM it broke on its own. He got fired that day, and I got 2 weeks off with full pay. Story 9. About 15 years ago, I worked at a major university in the IT department. After I was hired, it took me a couple of months to realize my boss was a sociopath, as was his 2 guy. Once I realized what I was dealing with, I just tried to keep my head down because I didn't want to job hop so soon after leaving my last job. But they made that impossible. We had a database administrator, and I was interested in becoming a DBA, so I talked to him a lot about what I should do to transition from a programmer to a DBA. The VP of IT, my boss's boss, would stop by and talk to me and ask me about my aspirations. So I told her about wanting to be a DBA, that I was actually taking night classes so I could. This was a woman whom my boss referred to as she who must be obeyed in a totally disrespectful manner. As the months went on, I saw more and more egregious behavior by my boss and his 2 toadies. We had a large corporation consulting on transition to their database. This included a young guy who was doing the database install, including ordering the right equipment and migrating the data. We also had student workers in our department. They were students who worked part-time hours. One of these was a young woman. The big corp young guy and the young woman started going to lunch together. Apparently, this was offensive to my boss, who threatened both of them with termination for fraternization. The university had no such rule. My boss was just making it up as he went. About 6 months after I was hired, the DBA quit. I went into our weekly staff meeting, and at the end, my boss announces that I'd been promoted to DBA. My spidey senses were tingling because of his tone of voice, and because this was the first I was hearing about it. After the meeting, I went to his office to thank him and tell him I really appreciated the chance. He was very angry, apparently. His boss had made him promote me. I had no idea. The next thing I know, I'm being called into my boss 2 guy's office. He tells me that performance reviews were coming up, and I would have to be reviewed on job description of DBA rather than the job description of my old position. That is, unless I turned down the DBA position. Yep, he was threatening me to get me to turn down the promotion. I asked him to see the written description of my old position as well as the one for DBA. He couldn't give them to me because they didn't exist. Now, I could be pretty stubborn, and this really pissed me off. I didn't do anything wrong, and now my job was being threatened. Part of my job duties during the 6 months of my employment involved working with the head of every department of the university, including the legal department. I had a good working relationship with every head of every department. So, I made an appointment with the university's head counsel. I explained the situation to him, including my boss making him promote me, and my boss threatening me with my performance review. I told him that, although I was studying to be a DBA, I was really not qualified to be one without some hard work, and if the university didn't want me to take the position, I would absolutely turn it down. I also mentioned my boss nickname for his boss, and the issue with the student worker and the big corp guy. Apparently, the student worker had already filed a harassment complaint, so the head counsel knew about it. He told me I had been promoted by someone boss who had every right to promote me, and I should not worry about anything. He said if my boss gave me any more trouble that I should let him know. A week later, my boss and his 2 toady were fired. My boss ended up working at a small city college, and is there to this day. I pity his employees. I left the university about 2 years later, and had a successful career as a DBA. Story 10. About 13 to 14 years ago, I was working as a web designer for a .com. In our immediate group were a creative director, a creative manager, and 2 of us who were designers, and we were all part of the marketing department. The creative director was a joke. Brought in by the previous VP of marketing who he was friends with, he hardly did any work himself, and just played online poker waiting on us to send him things for approval, and had never stick around late when the rest of us needed to stay late to hit a deadline or deal with a crisis, etc. The creative manager, who had been in charge for a couple years before the creative director's hiring, still ran the day-to-day. So the creative manager gave his notice that had accepted a new job, and when I met with the current VP of marketing to discuss transition, I mentioned that the creative director would need to step up and pull his weight. I guess a similar message was expressed by a number of people. And less than a week after the creative manager's last day, the creative director was fired. This kind of sucked because we went down from 4 to 2 people in our group. I was appointed acting creative manager, and we eventually did hire 1 more designer. I left the company a couple months later, too, after the latest VP of marketing was let go, and there was going to be a 10th different person overseeing marketing in my 5 years there. And the creative director had reached out at some point looking for files for his portfolio, I think, and it happened to be in the 2-week window where ID accepted my next job, but hadn't yet started, so I mentioned my new position. Well, he fires off a copy of his resume to the company president and tried to poach my new job out from under me. On my first day at the new job, the president mentioned that somebody else from that same company also applied for the job and forwarded me the application email to see if I knew him. Saw that the date was after he and I had last communicated. Story 11. Not my boss, but I helped my friend get her boss fired. He was a general manager and always grabbing her sides, purposely scheduling her to have shifts alone with him, asking her for nudes, asking her to sleep with him, etc. She reported it so many times to the owner big boss, and they said they couldn't do anything because they hadn't seen it and had no their reports other than her account. So I called and complained as a customer about how I witnessed him being creepy to her and how it made me uncomfortable. For the most part true, lol. I just don't shop there. Story 12. My manager wanted to prove him slacking off so he could write me up. So he watched CCTV footages, then wrote, printed out, and signed a detailed 17 pages worth of Word document. What did I do in the past 2 days? With timestamps like 0759 arriving, 0801 speaking with coworker A and B, 0807 sitting down at my desk, etc. He told me that he's not happy with my work ethics if I want to improve my efficiency. In Ford, I took the papers and showed his boss and told her that I'm not happy with my manager's work ethics and his efficiency might be better if he wouldn't watch 17 hours of CCTV footages to spy on an employee. She was terrified it would have been a rock-solid lawsuit for me. But I love my job, and we had to search for a new manager. Also, my salary raised. Story 13, I took a phone call on my cell when at my desk, middle manager came up and screamed at me, yelling about how I was not allowed to take calls for clients while at that office. I was a contractor and made it perfectly clear that I did work for multiple clients prior to doing work for this company. The CTO's office was 10 feet from mine. He came out and stood in his doorway listening to the rant. When the middle manager was done, I just looked over at the CTO and said it's him or me, and at the moment, I don't give a what you pick. CTO walked the middle manager out right then. Funny thing, I didn't hang up throughout the incident, and it was my wife on the other end. I was spending about 70 hours a week at their site, digging their staff out of a hole they had dug themselves in. Story 14, I left my last company due to a bully of a GM. Many people were leaving over him, causing problems, being racist, doing things people could easily sue them for claiming harassment. List goes on. Everyone informed HR during their exit interviews. He even tried to make my exit interview not happen, though they still weren't doing anything. I had been in my new job for a couple months now and was still getting complaints from my old team almost daily. So I made an email account and named concerned company name Crew. Sent an email to everyone who had an email account within the company explaining what he still did with events spanning from his start to the day prior. They fired him within the week, and my old crew thanked me. Story 15 basically said him quitting because of X. Boss looked at me and said, "Can I convince you to delay this by a week? Work from home for a week." Then X was gone, worked there for 5 more years, then 7 at the company that acquired us. Story 16, our desks were separated by a 5-foot cubicle wall. He was under the mistaken impression that it totally blocked sound. Thus I got to hear all his loud phone conversations, primarily his booty calls, including those with his boss fiancé. I figured it was none of my business and tried to ignore it. Well, there was a position in another department that I was interested in, and as per procedure, I handed an application to my talkative boss. Didn't hear anything further and followed up a couple of days later, only to be told that something must have happened to the application, filled out another one, and handed it in. As I return to my desk, I hear the boss on the phone with a friend laughing about how he had just trashed my application again and how he was never going to let go of me. I go to boss and angrily offer my resignation, telling him what I had just overheard, explaining that I was constantly hearing his phone calls like his booty calls like with woman's name and boss fiance's name. He got very quiet and told me to go back to my desk and he'll take care of everything. The next day, I come in and boss is gone. The day after, I have an interview with the other department got the position. I tend to avoid office drama, but really, he should have stuck to screwing his boss fiancé and not try to screw me as well. Story 17, one summer, I volunteered to help a conservation society in East Africa. The aim of the project was to educate the local rural population about poaching and to get them to help us stop it from the ground up. Anyway, I was staying with the lead ranger and his family, and on numerous occasions he served us meat that I'm 100% sure was poached. He tried to tell me that it was, but it was dark and gamey with lots of small bones. I think that it was small antelope like dik or diker. When I returned to Nairobi, I mentioned to my grandpa, his boss, that we had eaten some odd meals he investigated and found out that my boss had a poacher friend who was selling him illegal meat. He was fired. I didn't feel guilty. Poaching is awful. Story 18, I kept a detailed log of both of our times in and out of the office, as well as a detailed list of my work efforts. When I was called into HR to be fired, I produced the logs. I was given their position at the request of a former manager after HR fired my boss, Story 19, not my direct boss, but the new VP of our department. Everyone hated him and the poorly thought-through changes he was threatening to implement. A lot of my coworkers were talking about looking for other jobs. Our manager at the time, my direct boss, was really inexperienced and had no idea how to handle the situation. I was only a year out of college and didn't know what to do, but I was openly gay, as was the VP of a different department. We were the only 2 openly gay people at the company at the time, so we'd chatted a bit. I went to his office and said, "I don't know if you have any influence on my department, but we're going to lose half our team if someone doesn't do something about this guy." And I didn't know who else to come to. He asked me to have anyone else in the department who felt the same way come talk to him. I spread the word, and there were plenty of takers. A few days later, we all saw my department's VP have a private meeting with the CEO. After that meeting, he announced that he wasn't going to make the changes he had been talking about. He then proceeded to do absolutely nothing for the next month because it turned out that if he couldn't lead the department in a top-down authoritarian style, he genuinely didn't know what else to do. He was fired at the end of that month, apparently. The gay agenda is improving working conditions for everyone. You're welcome. Story 20, public agency hires someone out of private industry at the vice president level. She immediately begins hiring all her cronies and kissers from her old job at very nice salaries for jobs that didn't previously exist. That's the sort of corruption we're used to in North Carolina. so no biggie so far. But she runs out of slots she can just create with a little paperwork. So she starts to bully people in order to get them to quit, so she can fill their jobs with her friends. One job was that of executive assistant, and she was pretty harsh on the woman who had that job. I witnessed some of this and told the assistant to take it to HR, which she did, and HR just told her to document everything. So she did, and one day, the VP caught her recording a yell fest on her phone. The VP wanted to know what was up, so the exec assistant told her that HR wanted documentation and that I had told her how to record conversations on a cell phone, which was legal. By the way, I checked. So she yells at the exec assistant, yells at me, and then gets on the phone to HR, yelling at them that they were a bunch of incompetent fools and that she wanted to know what kind of Mickey Mouse outfit she was working for if she couldn't fire whoever that she wanted to fire. Now, we all know there are 3 TRVDHS in life. 1. No tugging on Superman's cape. 2. No land wars in Asia. 3. Don't off HR. Sure enough, HR initiates an investigation that took 300 hours of interviews with everyone in the department and a board of inquiry headed up by a senior VP. She was called to the senior VP's office at 4:30 in the afternoon, and when we came to work at 8 the next morning, her office was cleared out. Most of the cronies she hired were gone with a couple of months. No one wanted to work with them, so with no projects on their docket, they knew the writing was on the wall. When the last of the cronies left, her job was eliminated and her staff transferred elsewhere. It was like the evil VP and her mob never existed. Story 21, he was such a bullshitter. All talk. He yells at me one day for failing to do some tasks which got done anyway because someone got a hold of my boss. They only needed a mailing address I forgot to give them. Meanwhile, he's over at his buddy's house looking at his new boat. Pissed me off, so I called his boss and told him all the work that gets done out of this office is me. It was a long talk with him, but Big Boss said he had a feeling that was what was going on. This obviously wasn't the first time my boss was slacking off, but him giving me, when he wasn't even in the office, was the camelback straw. Boss didn't get fired, but left shortly after. Was an awkward couple of weeks. Big Boss ended up writing me a nice recommendation letter when I changed positions. Story 22, not fired, but demoted. I got fired and explained in my exit interview how the reason I wasn't making progress on my project is that I had no idea what I was doing. I was never trained. WFH boss in another location took off for 4 hours a day to run errands and go to the gym, etc., etc. They checked my story out and ended up demoting my boss, taking her off the project and taking away all her direct reports. Story 23, I quit, and his company collapsed without me. That kind of counts, right? Edit okay. Elaborating, when I was 16, I had a stint as a small-time social media star on Twitter, not because I'm particularly interesting or anything, but for 2 reasons. I got on Twitter really early in 2007, when it was way easier to get followers and engagement due to the site being less noisy and more stupid in terms of algorithms. And B, I stood out from a lot of other minor Twitter stars because I didn't let it get to my head while a lot of them were egotistical. And haughty, I followed everyone back, turned haters into friends instead of retaliating, etc. Through this fleeting fame, my former boss found me. He said he was setting up a regional media studio to help small and medium-sized local businesses with their social media marketing, and he planned to eventually franchise the business into other cities. He hired me on the basis of my large social following, 81,000 followers at the time. Obviously, having a large social following doesn't automatically mean you know how to market businesses on social media, but I adapted and studiously researched how to do my job properly. My boss didn't come from a creative background or a marketing role. He came from property background and was just sort of winging it and finding an alternative source of income after the housing crash. Being as young as I was at the time, I didn't really think about any of this stuff. The outcome was that I never received any training, had no real guidance in what I was doing, and was generally left to my own devices. Younger me thought it was great. I saw it as freedom, but looking back, I realized it was far too much freedom. The side effects of this disparity between my social media skills and his inability to communicate creative ideas manifested themselves as people trying to cut past the business and come straight to me, to ask me directly as an individual whether I'd do work for them, rather than giving my boss the money. I was respectful or naive enough to open up to my boss about this, and that's when things started getting a little bit manipulative. He told me I could go my own way or remain part of a business that'd soon be growing across the country. Fair enough, I thought. So I stayed, and 1 year, and I was 17, 18 at this time, I realized that managing brands via social media had naturally morphed me into something of a graphic designer. A lot of my time was spent creating eye-catching visuals in Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, etc. And so I suggested to my boss that we expand our media offering to include logo, graphic and print design, and visual branding consultancy. Again, I received no training. I worked all day and studied by myself late into the night. This pattern snowballed over the coming years. By the time I was 21, I was a social media manager, visual branding designer, copywriter, photographer, video editor, and web developer, all skills I nurtured independently with no input or guidance from my boss. The business was still operating in just one city, and my boss had started spending less and less time in the office. I still didn't realize this wasn't particularly normal until clients who came to the office to meet me constantly asked where he was. One day, a client went as far as to say, "You're basically running the business at this point." It was a huge glass shatter moment for me, and I suddenly realized that, yeah, although I wasn't actually managing the business and its admin work, etc., without me, there wouldn't be a service or product to sell. What's more, my wages hadn't gone up. Even though my "this is great, I have so much freedom" mindset had motivated me to continue working on stuff related to the business when I got home. As I was nearing 22, the owner of the building where the business office was located asked me if I'd help him fix his computer. It was just running really slowly because he hadn't managed his files very well, not really thinking of it as work. I agreed and headed into his office after work to help him out. As luck would have it, my boss walked in to hand over that month's rent. So he saw me there, he looked surprised, but didn't comment. He just gave the dude the rent and left the building. The next day, my boss wasted no time in probing me about what I was doing. He was speaking to me like a cop would speak to a suspect, asking me how long I'd been doing work for the landlord, what kind of work I was doing, why I hadn't folded the work into the business, etc. I explained I was just fixing up his computer, and he leapt into a lecture about how we needed to keep all work inside the business, or else we would never be able to grow into other cities. I turned 22. I'd been there for 5 years. My wages hadn't gone up. I wasn't allowed to do any work outside of the business. I hadn't witnessed any of the growth I'd initially been promised. My boss was only in the office 25 of the time, and I saw him uploading Instagram stories from him lunching, working out at the gym, walking his dogs, taking day trips, etc. While I was at the office managing everything, a lot of the time he didn't even warn me he'd not be in the office. It became the norm that if he didn't turn up, I'd be running everything for the day because I'd grown with the business from my youngest working age. I didn't know any different, so all of this felt completely normal to me. And because I worked all day and all night and had no firm social life, I never got any outside perspective until one day on a whim, I opened up to the landlord about it. He hadn't even realized I was the one doing all the work. He figured it was split fairly 50-50. He said the amount of work I was producing was on the same level as an agency with 3 or 4 employees. I started managing all of the branding, social media, and website maintenance for the landlord's business, but didn't broadcast that news to anyone. As I was nearing the age of 23, I met my now fiancée, a perfectly feisty woman who, as soon as I told her about my situation, passionately advised I start my own media studio. This is where I entered the long breakup period of my job, where I got increasingly depressed at work and physically felt my productivity slow to a near halt. My boss noticed, but never talked to me about it face to face. He started sending me irritated emails full of swear words, demanding explanations for why I hadn't delivered certain work by certain times and dates. While he was off sunning it up at the beach, it was like someone had pulled out his cork and let all the toxicity out in one torrent. My girlfriend hated him and gently pushed me to the point where I felt like I was ready to confront him about the dead end we'd wound up in. I asked a few of my friends about it, just to get a wider set of viewpoints on how I should go about it. They asked me things like, what does your contact say about you leaving the company and working with other businesses independently, legal stuff, And that's when I realized my lack of training over the past 6 years had also left me ignorant of the formalities of employment. I never had a contract. The real kicker was I never had employee liability coverage either. My boss wasn't even doing the admin stuff properly. Obviously, that meant he also had no control over me when it came to contracts, so I literally just walked in without my laptop and now, just realizing he never provided equipment either. Yikes, and sat there waiting for him to arrive. Thankfully, it was one of the days he decided to turn up. He went and sat down in his chair, asked me where my laptop was and why it wasn't working, etc. And so I just straight up told him that I was leaving the company to start my own media venture. He laughed a patronizing laugh and simply said, "All right, good luck then." Part of me felt like this was normal because he was usually quite cold like that, but another part of me knew that there should have been some sort of emotion and deeper discussion in that moment. I wanted to say, "So that's it," then to try to flesh the talk out, but that really was it. He just turned to his computer and typing away as if I wasn't there. So I just turned around and left, went home, and that was it. He did WhatsApp me a message later that day. All his caring and considerate communication came through digital, means perhaps he hired someone on a 0-hour contract to inject emotion into his texts, asking if we could meet at the pub for a proper goodbye. And we did. It was a nice gesture, but it felt very awkward and forced, as if he'd spoken to someone about it, and they'd coaxed him into doing it. He shook my hand, wished me good luck much more genuinely this time, and we parted ways, continued in reply. Story 24, not me, but my GF at the time. We were both working at a small burrito chain. She was front of house manager and I was kitchen manager. Above us was one senior manager and then the owner. We did tip pooling based on hours, and the senior manager always told my GF not to count the tips every night, as he divided it up at the end of the week. Well, of course she counted them every night. Turns out the senior manager was stealing almost $500 a week from employees and tips. And because his previous FOH manager never questioned him, it had likely been going on for years. She told the owners, and he was gone the next day. A week later, his wife left him. Story 25, I've told this story a few times before. So, they'll keep it short. I didn't get my boss fired, but she blames me. Boss and I didn't get along, but she didn't have the authority to fire me. But she promised her boyfriend my job. So she hires her boyfriend in another position, with the plan they'll drive me to quit, and then she can just promote him to my job. This lasted for about a month. She fired him when they broke up. He confessed their scheme to me on his way out. We'd actually become friends at this point, and I tell him he should really tell HR. HR does their investigation. She's fired because sleep with me and it'll give you a job is textbook harassment. And she tells anyone who'll listen that it's all my fault because I didn't quit like I was supposed to. Story 26, his boss asked me to keep tabs on him. He was working a fraction of his hours salaried, calling in hourly guys so he could leave early, not doing work while he was there, etc., etc. Story 27, I didn't technically get her fired, but when she refused to hire me full-time after 3 months on temporary like promised, I just said it wasn't worth it. Quit, and a week later about 30 people followed because they were getting similarly screwed. So they got rid of all of the management and transferred in new managers. Story 28, not me, but someone I know was harassed by the boss. After trying everything legal to get rid of him, she slept with him and told him to stop mid-coit. He did not stop. He got fired. She filmed for proof. Story 29, I worked in a call center once with a female supervisor. She was a particularly shitty person. Long story short, she hated me because I would refuse to date her. She asked multiple times, and multiple times I explained very nicely that I was not interested but would to remain friends. After about the third time, she started giving me negative marks for reviews, phone calls, and the such. One day, she pulled me into the office with another manager and proceeded to write me up for talking on my personal phone during work hours. Mind you, I had not done this. I looked at her and refused to do this, walked out of her office and into the department manager's office. This was my first complaint after about 3 years with this company. I explained the situation and advised what has been transpiring for months now. Apparently someone else had seen this about a month ago and had already went to management about what she was doing to me. Within 10 minutes, she was pulled into the office and demoted back down to my position. But in another department, the thing that sucked is that this department sat directly across from me. Story 30, in college, I worked in a takeout restaurant just off campus, and we were all employed by the school. I was 17 to 18 years old back in 2007-2008, and my boss, the manager, was a 40-something creeper, hitting on me, touching me inappropriately, trying to massage my shoulders, tickling me, putting his hands on around my waist despite me asking him to stop. Then he friended me on Facebook. I declined, and suddenly my work schedule was changed. I was on shift during hours when I had class, and when I explained that problem, I got taken off the schedule altogether. I told the assistant manager what was going on, which I was explicitly told by the manager not to talk to the assistant, and he reported what was going on to upper management. Boom. Manager was fired. I worried for a while if he was going to come after me for that. Story 31, he was presenting a PowerPoint that I had put together to all the managers in the building. There was something he wanted to add at the last minute that he had never told me about, and when it wasn't there, he verbally abused me for like 5 minutes straight. Yelling, name-calling, telling me to prove to him that I had a college degree and wasn't just making it up. I was a contractor, so I was afraid to complain to HR because I assumed they'd just fire me, but a lot of other people in the room did. After the meeting, I went into the shared drive folder to find the presentation notes where the extra information was supposedly located. I watched the last time change from a day ago to the current time. Then he immediately called and said it was right there in the notes file. He was fired the next day for unprofessional behavior.